Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
This is Ronda Chervin's Radio Journal, and I welcome you listeners, and this is something else I'm going to do today. It happens that I have two books recently, one published again, republished, and another one newly published by two writers who I admire enormously. And I want to tell you about these books, the gist of them, in hopes that you'll read the whole book. But, I know there are people who prefer listening to radio shows than to books. So an opening prayer would be, Dear God, you know how confused many Catholics are about different teachings, and we ask you please to help me describe these books and the main points of them in such a way that others may be as affected as I have been by the truth in these books. Amen. So the first book is Von Hildebrand's Morality and Situation Ethics, reprinted just now, actually reprinted exactly today. And the other one is a book about our newly canonized John Henry Cardinal Newman, a book about his grammar of Assent, written by Dr. Richard Geraghty and published by En route Books. So first I'm going to tell you about morality and situation ethics. And this was written many years ago by Dietrich Von Hildebrand, then updated with his wife Alice Von Hildebrand, and now it's been reprinted again. So for those of you who don't know, who was Von Hildebrand? He was probably the greatest teacher of Catholic ethics in the 20th century. And he was born in Italy. He was from German parents. He lived in Germany most of his youth. And he was studying philosophy. He studied with the great philosopher Husserl. He was brought up Christian but not Catholic. He became a Catholic when he was a young man, and then he became a philosophy teacher. But this was just the time when Hitler was taking over Germany, and he protested against Hitler, and he had to flee for his life, and he fled across Austria, then onward, and ended up going from France to New York City, and then became a philosophy teacher at Fordham University. And I had the joy of studying philosophy with him. Now, he wrote a big book called Ethics, which outlines true ethics. But he also wanted to refute something which was gaining ground in the Catholic Church even at his time, and this was relativism and situation ethics. So relativism is used now all the time for a term just for people who are skeptical about ethics. But the real meaning is that instead of ethics being about absolute moral principles, like something can never be done because it's wrong, should never be done, that when we say that something is wrong, it's only relative to the programming we've had as Americans, or the programming we've had as kids, or the programming in the church, and therefore it's just our own opinion and nobody else has to follow it, and that's relativism. Now, situation ethics is this theory that even though there are some general principles about what is right and wrong, you have to really look at your own situation that you're in or that other people are in, and then follow your own conscience. And so there would be nothing that was bad all the time. And if you have good motives for doing something, then you should go ahead and do them, even if in the past they were considered to be completely wrong. Now, while I'm describing this to you, I'm going to use examples, not necessarily ones that von Hildebrand gave in his book called Morality and Situation Ethics, Refuting Situation Ethics, but ones that I use in my book, Way of Love, because these ones are more typical of today. So we would think, as Catholics and also just as human beings, we would think that it's always wrong to torture an innocent person, that killing a baby in the womb, abortion, is always wrong, and terrorizing the innocent is wrong. Like big terror things, we would think as always wrong. But as someone who is into situation ethics would find reasons even for justifying sometimes doing those things. So just to make you understand why anyone could think of that, even, if an innocent person happened to know who had kidnapped your child, would you think about maybe it would be okay to torture this person until they told you where that child was? Maybe so. Or if someone was raped, would you think maybe that would be a reason it would be okay to abort the child? Or how about raining terror down on whole cities with a nuclear bomb in order to end the war? So people can easily think those things are exceptions in certain situations, that even if generally they're wrong, they're not wrong in those situations. Now, how does von Hildebrand refute this idea? Well, he starts with something very unexpected to me when I first studied this book, which is he starts with an underlying aspect to these discussions, which concerns what is called in the New Testament being Pharisaic. So Jesus was often condemning the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were condemning him, but he was condemning the Pharisees because even though the Pharisees taught the people what was right to do, just the same, they had these harsh judgments of them, and they were very picky about tiny things, and they themselves were not particularly good, but especially they had very harsh judgments of people. Now, okay, what is exceptional about von Hildebrand's book is the way he psychologically analyzes what goes into that kind of pride of the Pharisee, okay? And the one I find the most helpful to myself, because I tend in that direction of harsh judgments, is what he calls enjoying hurling denunciations against sinners. Enjoying hurling denunciations against sinners from the standpoint like, I am the truth, I have no sin, I can throw the stones at other people, like the famous example where they're hurling stones at this woman taking an adultery, and Jesus says, he who has not committed any sins, throw the first stone, and then they stop. See, it's a denial that I myself am a sinner, and then hurling denunciations at other people. Okay, now, does that mean that what those other sinners did that we denounce, does that mean that those sins are okay? No. Okay. What we're supposed to do is teach the truth with love, not with harsh judgment, but we're still supposed to teach the truth about what's wrong with these things. So, So now, many Catholics who think that some things the church teaches as wrong always want to say that people want to say about them, if I'm always saying that there's certain things like torture and abortion that are always wrong, other people want to say, well, that's because you're being harsh and you're being Pharisaic, see? And you're being judgmental. And how can you force your opinions on me? It's my body in the case of abortion. Okay? So they will say, instead, let's take another example that's very, very common. So, for example, most Catholics think that sex outside of marriage is wrong, but they want to make certain exceptions in certain situations. So they will say, well, it's wrong to bar hop and pick up strangers and have sex with them. That's horrible. But if it's an engaged couple and they don't have enough money to get married now because they want to finish college, well, and they're going to get married in a few years, well, that isn't the same thing. So in that situation, it could be right. But what's wrong with that is that sin is never good. Okay, so the fact that someone might be harsh in judging an engaged couple doesn't mean that it's good for an engaged couple to have sex before marriage. First of all, they're usually having contraceptive sex, but contraception is wrong. If you want to know why it's wrong, read my book, Making Loving Moral Decisions. It's part of the book, Way of Love. And if something happens and they decide that it's not a good match after all, they break up the marriage. So it's not as if they're really committed to each other and ready to build a nest for the child or even for themselves. See? So things can sound like plausible exceptions even when they're not. So, for instance, here, let's take another example. So, breaking the speed limit. So people say to themselves, well, the speed limits are good, but they're not moral absolutes after all. Since I'm a very good driver, I'm very late for this very important meeting, and I might lose this job if I don't get there in time. There's always delays. So I can wind in and out of the traffic at, say, 80 miles an hour on the freeway. Well, just because you have a situation where it seems like it's different from your normal driving situation, the situation is different. Your motive isn't just to have a joyride, but the motive is to something important. Imagine saying to the cop who picks you up for speeding, well, I thought this was a situation in which I should make an exception. See? Because it's wrong to drive dangerously. You could kill somebody. Okay. Now, I'm just introducing you to this book with a few of these examples. In the book itself, you have wonderful chapters on, for instance, the difference between the people say, well, I'm not obeying the letter of the law, but I'm obeying the spirit of the law. So, Jesus says about the spirit, he says, uses this in examples like his disciples eating the bread that was in the sacred, it was considered sacred for the temple when they were hungry. But that kind of rule is totally different from a moral rule. So, you can't say I'm following the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, if you have sex outside of marriage. Okay, so I'm not going to give you any more examples. I'm just going to urge you on that you would find this book, it's very readable. You would find it extremely helpful because right now in the church there are many, many people who claim that moral teachings are not obligatory. You don't always have to follow them. They're ideals, and then there are situations in which it would be God's will not to follow that ideal, but to follow something opposite to the ideal because of certain special circumstances. So it's a very, very important book to read. Okay. So now, how would you order this book if you wanted to get it? Now, ordering books is simpler than ever. So if you put in his name and the title, and on Amazon, it comes right up. So that's Von Hildebrand. That Von is a German Von, which is V, not F. So V-O-N, Hildebrand, Hildebrand, Von Hildebrand, Morality and Situation Ethics. And you just put in that title, and under Amazon, you go to Amazon, put in that title, and you can get the book either as a hardcover, paperback, or cheapest by Kindle. So that's about morality and situation ethics. But there's another book that since the last time I spoke on this radio journal came out, which is a great favorite of mine, and it's called A Companion to Newman's Grammar of Assent. And Newman is the famous Cardinal Newman, who's just been beatified, the great English theologian. And he's been called the greatest theologian of the 20th century, the greatest one since Thomas Aquinas, some people think. Now, he's a very good writer, Newman, but his books are still a little hard to read for a popular audience, which is most of you who are listening to the radio. Most of you don't have PhDs in theology, I assume. Okay, so this professor of philosophy, he was a professor in many places, including a professor at Holy Apostles College and Seminary online. Dr. Richard Geraghty. Also, you may have seen him on EWN programs called the 5-Minute Philosopher, I think it was called, or the 10-Minute Philosopher. Anyway, Richard Geraghty, Geraghty. He wrote this book called A Companion to the Grammar of Assent. And he wrote this book over many years because this book was crucial in his own walk as a Catholic over many, many years. And he tried to teach the book, and it was hard to teach the book. So he wrote this companion to the book, which you can read without even reading the great classics, because he explains everything. Explaining in very simple terms why Newman thought that even though theological propositions or theological truths are not something like 2 + 2 = 4, that nonetheless we can know them with certainty, that we can know with certainty, for instance, that Jesus was resurrected, that Jesus founded a church, that Jesus wanted the church to have a head, St. Peter, etc. Now, Newman was a convert from an English Anglican background. He lived in he lived through the whole of the 19th century. And so many, many people in England where their faith was getting watered down, partly because they were just skeptical. They didn't think, well, all these things are opinions you could have, but how can you know for certain that Jesus was resurrected? Or how can you know for certain that he founded a church? You know, all this kind of thing. So this book by Richard Geraghty explains his reasoning in an amazing way. So one of the analogies that Newman gives is England is an island, of course, Island. He said, how could you prove this? Suppose someone said, well, England is attached to Europe. It's just part of Europe. It's not a separate country. Even though it's not 2 + 2 = 4, thousands of years of people circling the island in a boat and seeing that it's an island, if a probability is that huge, then you have to believe it. So a way in which I say this now with respect to the resurrection of Jesus was that we don't realize that crucifixions were an everyday matter in the time of the Roman Empire. So people knew exactly what a crucifixion was like. So the idea that these apostles who were so afraid that they would be crucified, that after Jesus died, unless he resurrected, it's so improbable that they would be willing to face the same death as a crucifixion, which they knew what it was, unless they had seen that Jesus is bigger than death, that Jesus was resurrected. So that's just my example that I give. But the book itself is a wonderful book, and you can get this book from En route Books, right on the same website where you're listening to the radio. If you go to En route Books, the sponsor of WCAT Radio, you can find this beautifully published book by Richard Geraghty, Companion to the Grammar of Assent. So that's what I wanted to convey today, and God bless you all, and see you another time. As I said, I used to do these things once a week, but now I'm 82 years old, and I don't have much energy, actually. So I'm just doing them whenever something really hits me that I have a big desire for you to hear about. But if you wanted to get in touch with me personally, you could always write to my email, which is on the En route book section about my books. That's Ronda Chervin. God bless you all. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.